Hello. Today we're going to discuss Edward Bernays. Born in Austria and later an American citizen, Bernays lived until 1995, passing at the remarkable age of 103, effectively spanning the entire 20th century. Often regarded as the founding father of modern political and industrial propaganda, Bernays developed two influential techniques for manipulating public opinion, which he describes in one of his most famous works, Propaganda, subtitled How to Manipulate Opinion in a Democracy. If you're someone who dismisses conspiracy theories, Bernays might challenge that perspective, as he was deeply entrenched in the machinery of economic power, openly providing a guide for ideological control and opinion manipulation within democratic societies. One could even liken Bernays to a modern-day Machiavelli of the 20th century. Just as Machiavelli advised princes on how to manage and influence the people, Bernays advised politicians and industrialists on strategies to bolster both economic and symbolic capital. In politics, symbolic capital such as trust, sympathy, and credibility often translates into financial gains or election victories. Like Machiavelli, Bernays was unashamed of his strategies. He openly stated that democracy, in his view, is a system where an enlightened and intelligent minority should shape public opinion for the good of society. Bernays writes, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas largely suggested by men we have never heard of. With Bernays, there's no mystery. He lays it all out clearly. He lays it out plainly. If we summarize Bernays' foundational premise, it's rooted in a psychological perspective. He suggests that crowds are primarily driven by their instincts, what Freud termed the Idee, or in other words, impulses. Contrary to popular belief, democracy is not really the rule of the people. In fact, the very notion of power of the people becomes ironic. If people are governed solely by their instincts, they don't act in their best interests or even according to reason. Thus, democracy, Bernays argues, is not truly the people's power. Rather, it's a system where people's opinions are shaped not by force, but by influence. In this way, a democracy could be seen as a sophisticated form of dictatorship, a mature dictatorship, where control is exerted through influence rather than coercion. The risk of overt oppression is that people may eventually revolt or even start a revolution. When people recognize they are being controlled, they may rise up to reclaim their rights. However, in a democratic society, where opinions are subtly influenced rather than forcibly controlled, people feel as if they maintain control over their opinions and freedoms. Today, we'll explore how Edward Bernays' approach to propaganda keeps people subjugated, without them even realizing they're being manipulated. To understand Bernays' views, we must challenge our idealistic beliefs about democracy and recognize that those in power may prioritize their own interests over those of the people. As a side note, Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, from whom he drew substantial influence, especially regarding the role of the unconscious in decision-making. Freud posited that much of our mental activity is governed by unconscious desires, while our conscious mind represents only a small part of our true psyche. Bernays builds on this idea, noting, "The psychologists of Freud's school have shown that our thoughts and actions are compensatory substitutes for desires we have had to repress. In other words, we often desire things not because they are useful or valuable, but because they serve as symbols of other, perhaps hidden, desires. For example, a man might justify buying a car as a practical need, yet unconsciously, the car represents social status, success, or a means to impress his partner. This principle, that our actions are largely driven by motives hidden from us, applies as much to collective psychology as it does to individual psychology. A propagandist intent on success must grasp these hidden motives rather than just the reasons people provide to justify their behavior. Influenced by Freud, Bernays was also inspired by Gustave Le Bon, particularly Le Bon's theories on crowd psychology. Much of Bernays' work focused on applying his understanding of social psychology and crowd behavior to help politicians and industrial leaders expand their influence and power, effectively facilitating the workings of democracy. To illustrate his approach, let's look at a few of Bernays' influential campaigns. World War I propaganda. In the 1910s, during World War I, Bernays helped President Wilson sway American public opinion towards supporting the war. This effort gave rise to the famous Uncle Sam Wants You poster, which stirred Americans from their pacifist leanings to support the Allied forces. The Bacon Breakfast Campaign. Later, Bernays launched a campaign funded by the food industry to promote a hearty breakfast. He commissioned nutrition experts to publish studies praising the benefits of a filling breakfast, which was then widely circulated in the media, endorsed by 4,000 doctors. This led to a surge in bacon sales, bolstered by the authority of science and press backing. The Lucky Strike campaign, one of Bernays' most remarkable and notorious. Campaigns took place in the 1920s when Lucky Strike commissioned him to increase its tobacco sales among women. At the time, smoking was socially reserved for men, with women who smoked often stigmatized. Bernays aimed to shift public perception of smoking by organizing a symbolic march on Easter Sunday in New York in 1929. This parade, led by women holding cigarettes labeled as torches of freedom, recast smoking as a symbol of independence and power for women, shedding its negative associations. This last campaign underscores a key element of propaganda, attaching a powerful symbolic meaning to an action. By linking cigarettes with independence and empowerment, Bernays transformed smoking from a stigmatized behavior to one socially endorsed as a sign of liberation, showing the depth and complexity behind his manipulative strategies. She became a symbol of empowerment and liberation. It wasn't just about promoting cigarettes, as many doctors in the 1920s claimed smoking reduced stress. Bernays' strategy went further, positioning a smoking woman as someone reclaiming her freedom, a revolutionary figure. This approach was more impactful because it didn't just appeal to reason. It tapped into the unconscious, into symbols and archetypes. It shifted the function of the cigarette from an object to a symbol of autonomy. Today, when we see a woman smoking, it doesn't immediately occur to us that this association began as a propaganda tactic by Bernays. Instead, it's often viewed as a sign of gender equality, an achievement of hard-won rights. Yet this struggle was carefully orchestrated. The main beneficiaries were tobacco companies. Bernays' manipulation of public opinion masked a commercial agenda under the guise of social progress. The core of opinion manipulation is to plant ideas in our minds, making us complicit in our own domination. Unlike coercion, which is overt, manipulation allows us to feel in control, acting freely, yet unaware of the influence behind our choices. The success of modern ideological propaganda lies in equating freedom with desire, reducing freedom to impulsive gratification. For a deeper dive into how desire and consent have replaced coercion in the power structures of post-World War II societies, consider Michel Klausgaard's The Capitalism of Seduction and Neo-Fascism and Ideology of Desire. Klausgaard outlines how the old systems of control, state and religion, gave way to permissive systems that celebrate individuality and desire, ushering in a new form of domination, not by constraint, but through freedom, desire, and consent. The market of desire seeks to expand relentlessly through the mass adoption of libertarian liberalism, a movement exemplified by May 68. This era marked the rise of a consumer-driven society, fueled by the industries of leisure, pleasure, entertainment, and fashion. However, traditional social morals previously hindered the consumer, reinforcing the idea that only what was earned could be enjoyed. Banking capitalism, on the other hand, enabled people to enjoy without ownership, thus requiring a sweeping transformation of cultural norms, legitimatized by both the state and influential figures like Cohn-Bendit and Pompidou. Michel Klausgaard, in The Metamorphoses of the Class Struggle, describes how this collaboration between liberal-minded reformers and libertarian movements dismantled the old, conservative values, making way for a new society. This shift illustrates why manipulation, driven by desire, is more effective than constraint-based authority. Today's market ideology thrives on consumption, which relies heavily on desire, and the conversion of desire into buying actions. Advertising and propaganda target this very impulse, appealing to our instinctual drives as the most potent driver of consumption. Economic power, therefore, has no need for constraint. Its power lies in fueling desire, encouraging indulgence, and removing inhibition. In this process, the impulse itself becomes the most persuasive force. To clarify a key concept, indoctrination is often seen as a repression-based approach to control, as seen in religion, which traditionally calls for renunciation of desires in favor of spiritual pursuits. The classic 7 deadly sins, gluttony, envy, lust, sloth, demonstrate the disdain for bodily desires. Many religions hold that sanctification requires distancing oneself from worldly pleasures, embodying purity by resisting impulses rather than indulging them. Thus, while traditional ideologies controlled through repression, today's consumer-driven society manipulates by appealing directly to desire, turning liberation into a tool of control. Religions can be viewed as systems of repressive indoctrination based on strict obedience to moral laws, while the ideology of desire forms a permissive indoctrination system focused on impulse-driven actions. This dynamic echoes Freud's dichotomy of the superego, the moral authority or law within us, and the ID, the domain of primal impulses and desires. In religious contexts, the superego demands restraint, urging adherence to moral codes that prioritize obedience over personal satisfaction. Conversely, when an individual is led primarily by the ID and its drives, the most effective form of control is to manipulate that drive, channeling desires in ways that benefit those in power. Dictatorships traditionally rely on legal obedience and often the cult of personality surrounding a single authority figure. Democracies, however, often govern through satisfaction of desires, where pleasure and consumption overshadow objective needs. By promoting desires as virtues rather than taboos, democracies can encourage social compliance through fulfillment of these desires, under the belief that to satisfy one's impulses is to be free. Propaganda in democracies, therefore, seeks not to forbid impulses, but to encourage indulgence, positioning pleasure as a way to maintain societal order. In societies where basic needs are met, the desire for pleasure often becomes paramount. Here, a reversal in traditional values is evident. To restrain desires is seen as subservient, while indulgence becomes equated with personal empowerment. By addressing people's emotions rather than their rationality, those in power can direct actions and shift focus away from objective interests. Several psychological techniques are key in manipulating opinions. For instance, appealing to fears is particularly powerful. Fear can override the desire for freedom, making restrictive measures more acceptable as people prioritize security in times of perceived danger. This strategic play on fear is foundational to contemporary social and political influence, as it helps people rationalize measures that may otherwise be resisted. As I mentioned, the freedom to act upon one's desires and drives generally requires a stable context in which basic needs, particularly physiological ones, are met. In Maslow's hierarchy, for instance, security precedes freedom. Thus, appealing to people's fears can become an effective way to enforce compliance. This prioritization of safety over freedom remains a powerful tool for controlling public sentiment, as it can justify measures that might otherwise be deemed restrictive. Another technique is to create stark divisions by framing debates in binary terms, for or against positions without middle ground or nuanced discussion. This approach leverages a principle of polarization that oversimplifies complex issues, encouraging individuals to align with one camp or another. Such binary framing can quickly escalate into Manichaeism, a black-and-white worldview that stifles critical thinking. This method capitalizes on the human need for belonging, pushing people to identify with groups rather than fostering independent examination of the issues at hand. The third tactic focuses on framing issues in terms of value clashes. This method is particularly effective because it taps into deeply held beliefs and emotional responses, often bypassing rational analysis altogether. Take, for instance, the contentious topic of surrogacy. Proponents may advocate for it from the standpoint of equality and progress, emphasizing freedom from natural limitations and support for fertility solutions. However, viewing surrogacy economically reveals a commodification of human life, where disadvantaged women may be driven to surrogacy for financial reasons, thus sparking debates around the ethics of a birth economy. When governments pursue such polarizing issues, they often appeal to values like equality or democracy, knowing these ideals hold significant sway in public opinion. For instance, the Iraq War was framed as a defense of human rights and democracy. This ideological framing worked to mask underlying motivations, such as resource control and strategic interests. By tapping into values central to a collective identity, leaders can divert attention from their true objectives, persuading the public to support actions that, under a more transparent lens, might face greater resistance. The photo of Alan Kurdi, the young boy whose body washed up on a Turkish beach, was a tragic and powerful image that captured global attention. It sparked intense emotional reactions, bringing worldwide awareness to the Syrian refugee crisis. But it also illustrates how images can influence public opinion. As discussed in the Society of the Spectacle, such displays turn real suffering into a sort of visual spectacle for mass consumption, carefully staged to elicit specific responses, often without the viewer even being aware of it. This form of emotional manipulation functions to make us consent to policies and actions we might otherwise oppose if presented in a purely rational context. Emotions become an unexamined entry point into our perspectives, bypassing critical thinking and fueling decisions that align with certain agendas, often hidden from view. The society we live in now is a spectacle of staged emotions, be it through media portrayals of progress, freedom, or equality. This continuous exposure can cloud our capacity to critically assess situations, especially when they exploit empathy or evoke fear and outrage. So, while the emotions stirred by such images are genuine, there's a need to remain cautious and aware, separating our feelings from a potential agenda and regaining the balance of reasoned discernment alongside our natural human empathy.